Okay, I didn't get a chance to do the final slides in this week's lecture, so I'm doing them now. And in particular, I'm going to talk about Hall and Franzese, 1998, which talks about two coordination problems in wage bargaining. First coordination problem emerges among different participants in the process of wage bargaining. So assume that there's a group which we'll call us that is, say, for example, the workers in a particular firm. And they're engaged in bargaining over what their next contract is going to be in collective bargaining. And in making their bargain, if they've got some bargaining power, they've got to decide what to fight for, and in particular, they need to decide should they fight to make their wages go up with inflation, to index them to inflation, as it's called. Well, there are two possibilities. They could decide to price inflation in, so to assume that inflation will happen, or they can assume that no inflation will happen. Just to make things simple, we'll give them just those two choices. Now, if they assume that no inflation will happen, and they're wrong because all the other workers in the economy either demanded immediate raises and got them because they expected inflation, or they had their contracts indexed to inflation, which meant that when prices went up, wages went up, so the prices tended to go up more. A bargainer that's wrong and has assumed no inflation when inflation actually happens, they have their real wages go down. So you might say, well, probably then they ought to price inflation in if they have enough bargaining power to demand that from their employers. That's what the individual firm ought to do. And if the individual firm ought to price inflation in, then everyone prices inflation in, and you get what is called a wage price spiral. A wage price spiral just means that prices go up, wages go up to match prices. Because wages are an element of cost, they drive up prices further, which drives up wages further, and so on. And so, theoretically, one winds up with a spiral of rising prices. So how is this spiral to be avoided? Well, suppose that wages are somehow coordinated, that rather than just having to assume what everyone else is going to do, we can actually know what they're going to do because, for instance, all of the wage bargaining units get together and decide what they're going to do collectively. Then they can all assume no inflation, and you wind up with stable prices. So basically, the coordination problem is, I'm happy to price inflation into wages here, as long as I'm sure that there's not going to be inflation because nobody else is pricing inflation into wages. To get that, you need coordination. To get to here, you need coordination. Absent coordination, you wind up here with the wage price spiral. Now let's turn to the second coordination problem for central banks and wage bargainers. And this coordination problem arises from a difficulty that central banks have, at least in theory, of making a commitment to keep inflation low. And the reason that this difficulty arises is as follows. Suppose that we start with a bank that promises zero inflation. And suppose that this promise is believed. What are actors in the economy going to do? They're going to sign contracts, and one element of those contracts, for instance, might be that wages are not indexed to inflation. Okay? So because the bank has promised zero inflation, contracts are signed in which wages are not indexed to inflation. What then happens if the bank inflates anyway? Well, if the bank inflates anyway, what firms see is that their sales are going up, so they'll make more stuff. They increase output, and they see their sales going up, and they say, well, maybe this is just a sign of inflation, and our costs are going to go up later. But they don't have to react to that right away. Why? Because the wage contract that's been signed isn't one that accounts for inflation. So this is why people believe there is a time inconsistency of monetary policy preferences, to use the jargon for central banks. Why people believe that central banks will first promise an absence of inflation and then be tempted to inflate later. They believe that banks will have this temptation because if the initial promise is accepted and no inflation is built into the wage structure, then creating inflation actually, at least for a time, increases output until, at any rate, wages adjust. So if the central bank faces a situation where initially it promises, and if its promise is believed, it can gain some benefit from violating its promise, that promise might not be believable. The low inflation promise, at any rate if you believe this analysis, is not credible. So in Hall and Franzese, what they do is they look at independent central banking as a potential solution to this second coordination problem, and how it intersects with centralized wage bargaining as a solution to the first coordination problem. So, for instance, in the German model, the intersection looks like this. You start with an independent central bank that gives a low inflation promise, and coordinated wage bargainers pay attention to that. They believe that. They believe it precisely because the central bank is independent, so it won't experience the temptation I've just talked about on the prior slide. This is so only if you have an independent central bank that's set up to care only about inflation and not about output, at any rate. So the independent central bank gives a credible low inflation promise. Coordinated wage bargainers pay attention to it. And this means then that the central bank doesn't have to fight inflation. Inflation doesn't emerge from the wage price spiral, so the central bank doesn't have to fight it. How would the central bank fight it? It would fight it by raising interest rates, restricting monetary having a restrictive monetary policy, and this would be harder on the economy. So they think of this as a good model. Okay, that's it.